My name is Tasnia, and I am a graduate assistant for Dr. Quinn, and I work with Curriculum Theory Project. And this is our regular lunch and learn. We arrange this every semester, and our guest of speaker today is Dr. David Kirshner. I'm going to introduce him and his work, and hopefully we'll start from that point onwards. Dr. Kirshner is a professor of secondary mathematics education at Louisiana State University, where he has worked since 1987. His research focuses on the psychology of learning, mathematics education, and how learning theories influence teaching practices. In the Curriculum Theory Project Lunch and Learn lecture titled as Learning Theory, Dr. Kirshner will explore whether learning theories are useful for education. The talk examines how different psychological perspectives on learning influences teaching strategies and classroom practices. This talk is not just a lecture series for today. It's going to be published under Cambridge University Press, I hope this semester, at the end of this semester. He will discuss the challenges educators face because learning theories often offer different and sometimes conflicting views about how students learn. The lecture also introduced a new approach that accepts the diversity of theories rather than trying to combine them into a single model. And let's welcome Dr. David Kirshner.
All right. Thanks everyone for coming. The food is really good, and it's not too late to grab some to have with you. All right. Well, people often ask me, David, what have you been doing for the last 25 years? And I'm glad that you're here to hear the answer. The title question is learning theory useful for education? And not to be too anticlimactic, the answer is no. Excepting for certain enclaves like special education and sports training that have well-defined theoretical foundations, serious learning theory does not enter into the practice of teaching, by which I mean it doesn't enter into what teachers think about on a daily basis as they teach. What makes its way into general educational parlance from psychology are facile applications like teach the student's learning style, or teach the brain. And you can find very informative critiques of these very common tropes in educational thought. The traditional Ed Psych course, which was once a staple of teacher education programs, is now relatively rare. And foundations for teaching practice as often are built around philosophical premises, political theories, moral precepts, spiritual aspiration, as around learning theory. Yet, learning is the very purpose of teaching, so learning theory has a claim to being a privileged foundation for pedagogy. And deep insights into learning have been developed in various branches of psychology: behavioral, cognitive, developmental, sociocultural, among others. So, why does learning theory not provide foundations for teaching practice? I'm not going to take time to make that a question that we discuss. I will say that in general, there are two kinds of answers that are given. First is that not the slide I thought it was. Okay, the first is that learning is approached, that learning theory, that research is not conducted properly. And there are a variety of critiques that that's the reason that learning theory doesn't figure more prominently in teaching. And the other is an epistemological position that learning, that human learning is simply not the kind of thing that can be scientifically rendered. Now, these are common explanations. I want to emphasize that I'm talking here about theory, not research. We often talk about, in education, we talk about best practices, where a best practice is a valid education practice that has been successfully replicated at multiple educational settings with similar positive student outcomes. Best practices tell us about the effectiveness of methods. A theoretical base informs the generation of methods. Where do we get our methods from in the first place? For example, if we consider the medical sciences, we might have a cure for cancer coming out of theoretical analysis of the functioning of cancerous cells. So based on that theoretical knowledge, they might find some way to, for example, interrupt the reproductive process of the cancerous cells, and that becomes then a proposed remedy for cancer. But the validation of the proposed cure is just a different matter. So what I'm talking about here is I'm talking about really the absence of theoretical foundations, not the absence of a research base. It's this layer of theory that makes medicine scientific, as opposed to, say, herbalism, which is a compilation of experience. This is true regardless of whether or not herbal remedies are subsequently validated as effective through research. So let's put medical practice and educational practice up beside each other. Medicine is concerned with health and disease. Education is concerned with learning. The medical sciences collectively inform medical practice. Learning sciences explore learning, yet somehow the learning sciences do not provide the same kind of firm scientific foundations for teaching that we get for medical practice from the medical sciences. So why do the learning sciences not provide the thoroughgoing foundations for teaching that medical sciences provide for medicine? And this is where I should have said the part about there being questions about how researchers in education go about using learning theory, and there are also epistemological issues. I'd like to propose a different answer to that question. In fact, I would like to ask anybody who has not taken a class with me to suggest why is it that the learning sciences do not support educational practice in a scientific and thoroughgoing fashion as contrasted with the medical sciences, which do provide a firm foundation for medical practice.
I have an opinion, but you're not going to like what I'm going to say. Can I still say it?
Janet?
Yeah. Okay. So I would say that cognitive psychology, which is my field of study, has a really good scientific basis that could be applied to education. It just, that hasn't been, the success of bringing it over into practice just hasn't happened.
Could you say that again louder?
Yeah, so I would argue that my field of study, cognitive psychology, has a lot of theoretical things that could tell you how memory works, how learning works. It just hasn't made it over into education. It's there if people would look at it.
Okay, so basically, somehow, procedurally, educators are not doing what we need to do to take advantage of the fruits of research in psychology.
And maybe because they're not aware of it, if nobody's taking ed psychology classes anymore.
That is a common understanding of why is education not able to take advantage of learning theory. Any other proposals? So, what I'm pointing out here is that there's a profound difference between the medical sciences and the learning sciences. Not so much as individual sciences, but in their relation to each other. Because the medical sciences basically are conceiving of health and disease through compatible lenses, whereas the learning sciences each approaches the notion of learning in a way that is completely independent from what the other branches of psychology are thinking. So we have, in the case of the medical sciences, we have a series, we have a set of, in the case of medical practices, we have a set of learning sciences that collectively raise up a platform of pedagogy, or rather of medical practice. However, we don't have the coordination among theories that would similarly enable a coherent practice of teaching. And so what we end up with is we end up with different theories pointing in different ways. And so we have basically a sort of a fractured knowledge base for teaching. And the question that I am engaging today in this talk is the question of how can we possibly have a coherent theoretical basis for pedagogy when learning theory is fractured across incommensurable schools of thought. That's the topic. So, chapter 2, history lesson. What we're going to do is we're going to look at how the psychological community, the psychology, particularly the educational psychology community, has dealt with the problem that education faces of multiple theoretical frameworks that are pointing in inconsistent directions. So I would argue that that problem of inconsistent theoretical foundations from psychology is the single biggest challenge that education faces. And so we're going to look at how education and educational psychology communities have responded. And I'm looking historically over a 100-year span and noting that there are 5 strategies. These strategies arose sequentially. But as problems emerged with one solution, a new strategy was developed and implemented. However, when a strategy is found wanting and a new one introduced, it doesn't erase the old one. In fact, all of these strategies, which I will describe in the next few slides, all of these strategies continue to be used. And we will also see that the enduring problematics of educational discourse have their source in the strategies that have been used. So let's take a look at the unitary theory strategy first. The idea here is that we select a single learning paradigm, typically the dominant paradigm in psychology at a given point in time, and we declare it sufficient for all of education's needs. Behaviorism, during much of the early and middle part of the last century, was in that position, and educators attempted to reduce all learning to stimulus-response conditioning. We can see as this history plays out that there has been competition across these paradigms of psychology. So an early one was between the progressive education movement, underwritten by John Dewey's functionalist psychology, and it eventually lost out to Thorndike's behaviorism. Behaviorism then attempted to extend from unmediated response conditioning to verbal behavior, and that was rebutted in a very famous book review written by Noam Chomsky. And at that point, that's often credited with the transition of cognitive science moving up to the forefront. Cognitive science, in turn, has attempted to extend from decontextualized puzzle solving, which it does very well, to contextual reasoning. And that has been critiqued by other scholars in establishing the situated cognition branch. Okay, so we can see that this history, select a single theory and declare it adequate for all, has produced a history of conflict, and it has problematics in education that come directly from that strategy. One is that it limits the richness of education, and another is that it leads to factionalism, when different groups of educators congregate around different learning theories. So historically, the strategy of identifying the learning theory that will serve for everybody, it just didn't really work. And so we move on to the next strategy, which is the integrative theory strategy. This is a strategy of creating new theories that integrate independently coherent perspectives. So, for example, situated cognition theory, social constructivism are theoretical efforts to integrate individual and social perspectives. These aspirational theories fight against the incommensurability of the basic theorizations, and basically all of these theoretical efforts are works in progress. None has really succeeded, even though the movements of integrative theory have generated a lot of enthusiasm, notions of apprenticeship, which are foundational to the pedagogy, to making these theories relevant, has been an important thought process in education. But these unresolved units of analysis lead to unclear educational implications, right? Because they never really did succeed in creating a sustainable integrative theory. We move next to the holistic strategy, which is very, very simple and appealing, isn't it? Simply declare learning to be whole, to be a single, multifaceted construct reflecting a wide range of learning theories. Isn't that neat? In fact, How People Learn, which is a tremendously influential text in education, embraces, I list 12 schools of psychology, and it identifies itself as being based on, quote, a new theory of learning that is coming into focus. historically, these holistic visions have inspired great visions of teaching based on the synergistic science of learning, where everything just works together. It's so lovely, so inspiring. How people learn has been cited over 32,000 times, and it is third most downloaded National Academies Press publication in history. Its recommended practices, since it has basically an endless palette of theory, what happens is that it puts together theories that in the end justify practices that the authors think are worthwhile practices. But it could just as easily take that same combination, infinite range of theoretical possibilities, and create whatever it wants. So we're not really getting any kind of foundations, any theoretical basis for pedagogy when we just lump all psychological theories together. The fragmented theory strategy is what we find implemented in the classical, the traditional ed-psych textbook. In these textbooks, you take each learning theory and you give it its own chapter, and each has its own implications, okay? So, in other words, it is left to the teacher to be able to figure out, what am I supposed to do with all of these discordant recommendations for practice that are presented from these different theories? So this, in other words, offloads to teachers the problem that we as a community should be facing: how to make productive use of multiple learning theories. Finally, the local theory strategy, which often goes by the name of design science, marshals theoretical tools for separate educational problems. What happens is that a researcher or a group of research will sort of convene around some site of educational practice and theorize about what's going on and what should happen, bringing in whatever tools seem relevant to that particular problem. The problematic that this creates is that we end up with all of these different theoretical conglomerations focused on separate and independent problems. So we have no way to scale up what are the fruits of this kind of research into some kind of general pedagogical methods. Okay, so that's an overview of the 5 strategies that have been taken in the past. And I'd like to now pose a historical puzzle. As we've seen, the misalignment of learning theories has been an enormous challenge for education and for psychologists and educational psychologists who care about education. Ed-psych specialists have tried a wide variety of strategies for dealing with the multiplicity of learning theories, each of which has solved some problems while creating brand new ones. Yet, there is one thing that we have never seen in this 100-year history. That is, we have never seen a group of educational psychologists representing different branches of psychology coming together and saying, look, guys and gals, education is struggling with the fact that we have multiple paradigms that are being expressed in the different branches of psychology. What should we do? What are the possibilities? What would be an effective strategy? That conversation never happened in that 100-year history. Rather, educational psychologists have observed problems created by the latest strategy and put forward a new strategy to handle those problems, a kind of a haphazard way forward. This is a disturbing absence from the history of educational thought that demands explanation. So, I'll explain. I'd like to reference Thomas Kuhn's theory of scientific paradigms. I suspect many of you are familiar to some extent with Kuhn's work. Kuhn identified a transition that all sciences go through en route to becoming mature, paradigmatic sciences. They start in the pre-paradigm or adolescent phase, characterized by multiple competing schools of thought. Eventually, one of the paradigms is able to prevail, unifying the science, which now has advanced to the mature, paradigmatic phase. For example, the science of optics was pursued in, quote, a number of competing schools and sub-schools until Newton's optics drew in researchers from competing schools and unified the science of optics. Okay, that's an example that Kuhn gives in his book. The social sciences in general and psychology in particular were Kuhn's models for pre-paradigmatic, contemporary pre-paradigmatic sciences, sciences that have not yet gelled into mature science, that have not achieved the initial unification that marks the transition. This Kuhnian analysis gives us a way to understand the historical dynamics of learning theory, as sketched above. Rather than collaborate together for education's benefit, learning theorists are locked in an existential battle to unify their science. Because remember, in coming together, there has to be a single winner. And what happens is that the other schools just basically lose membership and they fade away. So we can see evidence of this imperative towards unification. If we look again at the historical, the strategies that have been used historically. If the unitary, which was the first strategy employed, if it had been successful, it would have immediately unified the science of psychology. Psychology would have had a shared paradigm that everybody subscribed to. Didn't, and so psychologists moved on to the integrative strategy, where in order to be able to unify the science of psychology, you first have to create an integrative theory, which people tried mightily to do, and still some do. The holistic, so you can see that we're kind of moving away from the immediacy of unifying psychology. The holistic strategy of claiming unification now and hope the field buys it, in fact the field didn't buy it, and there are no psychologists who jumped into the camp created by educational psychologists in the holistic camp. In the fragmented approach, there is no claim for unification, right? That's where the textbooks have different chapters. But at least there's a possibility that a unification will emerge in practice, that teachers will be able to kind of find a way to put these things together. Finally, the local theory strategy, in which you proliferate all of these different theoretical conglomerations, leaves aside the question of unifying learning theory for some kind of a later phase. Okay, so we can see that we are backing away from the immediacy of unification. We're backing away to more and more remote possibilities. Psychology strategies for helping education handle the multiple theories of learning have always been in service of psychology's imperative toward unification. Since educational psychologists have not looked dispassionately at the problem of multiple learning paradigms, it's up to us to do it. Since learning theory is fractured across multiple incommensurable paradigms, and since our goal is to ground pedagogical methods in learning theory, arguably the simplest and most obvious solution is to constitute pedagogical methods in genres, special purpose teaching methods, each seeking to promote learning in a specialized sense, each informed by its own theorization of learning. Looking back historically, we can see why the ed-psych folks never suggested a genres approach. Because whereas the prior strategies leave open at least a glimmer of possibility that learning theory eventually coalesces, the genre strategy reifies learning theory in its contemporary, current, separated, pre-paradigmatic state. Okay, so the strategy that I'm proposing is this genre strategy, and it's, in my view, the simplest and most obvious solution to the problem of multiple learning theories, but it is directly contrary to the psychologist's passionate imperative towards eventual unification. So, here is the genre strategy. Identify the distinct learning goals that motivate educators across the broad enterprise of education. Drawing on the wealth of psychology's learning theories, devise distinct theorizations of learning corresponding to these separate learning goals, and develop practices of teaching in genres, each one specific to a separate learning goal informed by its own theorization of learning. That is the genres strategy. And my forthcoming book, Genres of Teaching, is a methods text for teaching that aims to reconstruct teacher education and teaching in accordance with the genre strategy. 3 learning goals are identified: skills, concepts, and cultural practices. Those are, in my view, the learning goals that education has traditionally and historically been interested in achieving, and they correspond roughly with the knowledge, skills, and dispositions that many of you are familiar with from NCATE and CAPE. Those are the accreditation agencies for teacher education programs. Chapters of Genres of Teaching lay out the theorizations, the associated pedagogies, the logistics of teaching in genres, the politics of control of teaching, assessment practices, and the structure of teacher education programs to accord with the genre strategy. So this didn't actually work. Okay. So here is the genres framework. We have as our learning goals, skills, concepts, and cultural practices. Each of them is informed by a theory, a theorization that comes out of the schools of psychology. So behaviorism, for example, builds on behaviorism and on implicit learning theory, and I have to update that slide, also on neural net psychology. The construction of concepts depends on the theorization is basically a Piagetian theorization coming from developmental psychology. Likewise, cultural practices have their own theoretical base, and from these theorizations, we get pedagogical objectives, we get pedagogies. There's a high support and a low support pedagogy associated with each of these teaching genres. And I'm not going to go into the details of the framework any further than that. I want to emphasize that what I'm attempting to do is untangling, not replacing, the existing theoretical theorizations and practices, rather to untangle the intuitions about learning and the aspirations for teaching that are currently tangled together in integrative and holistic discourses. Okay, so one could think of this whole sort of framework as simply replacing everything that we have tried to do and everything that we have thought about in the past. But that is not the intention. The intention is to, in fact, bring us closer to the things that we aspire to and to the coherent streams of thought that have helped partially to guide us by putting them together in a framework. If we don the refractive lenses of genres, the fault lines and incoherences of contemporary pedagogical methods jump into view. So, for example, inquiry teaching, which I believe is promoted and extolled by many in this room, aims to marry together concept learning and learning of the valued cultural practices. And it does so by putting students in groups to wrestle with challenging content problems. Okay, I'm sure that you're familiar with inquiry teaching methods. What is not recognized is that supporting concept learning for most students requires extensive teacher orchestration of tasks and solution processes, which conflicts with the autonomy needed for students to develop creativity and independence as problem solvers. So we are marrying together goals that are inherently inconsistent with one another. But we do it within a discursive frame of holism that makes it seem like everything is going to work out. We paper over these fault lines using the talisman of metacognition, which turns out, if you look at it carefully, to be both a requirement for students to be successful in independent concept learning, and it is also a goal for enculturation teaching. The cat is chasing its tail in this kind of inquiry pedagogy. And for those of you who are oriented towards reform methods of teaching, don't despair, because traditional methods come in for equally harsh criticism when you can see the fault lines in the pedagogies that are prescribed. Okay, and that is it. 12:21, not too bad. We have some time for conversation.
All right.